Picture this, a company so powerful it didn't just trade, it ruled nations. The East India Company wasn't just a corporation, it was an empire in itself. From humble beginnings as a group of British merchants to controlling half the world's trade and amassing fortunes unimaginable, the East India Company redefined what a corporation could be. But beneath this story of wealth and power lies another, a tale of exploitation, corruption, and one of the most spectacular downfalls in history. What went wrong? How did the world's first multinational corporation rise to such staggering heights, and why did it crumble under its own weight? Today, we're diving into the forgotten story of the East India Company, a cautionary tale that still echoes in the corridors of power and commerce. It's a cold December day in 1600. A group of ambitious London merchants gathers in a dimly lit room, their minds set on a daring vision. Europe is ablaze with stories of the exotic East, lands brimming with spices, silk, and gold. But these riches lie behind daunting challenges, perilous seas, fierce competition, and the shadow of failure. Yet, these merchants are undeterred. They seek not only wealth, but to carve their names into the annals of history. What they build will become the world's first global corporation, the East India Company. At the heart of this venture was a shrewd understanding of opportunity. The late 16th century was a time of intense rivalry. The Spanish, Dutch, and Portuguese had already established lucrative trade routes in the East, reaping immense profits. England, still recovering from its defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, wanted its share of the spoils. The merchants' answer? A charter from Queen Elizabeth I herself. On New Year's Eve in 1600, she granted them exclusive rights to trade in the East Indies, thus planting the seeds for what would become a commercial juggernaut. But the journey was anything but smooth. The fledgling company faced overwhelming odds. Initial voyages to the East Indies were fraught with danger. Ships braved treacherous waters, unpredictable monsoons, and the constant threat of piracy. The Dutch East India Company, already a formidable force, was not about to relinquish its dominance easily. England's merchants struggled to establish trading posts, often at the mercy of local rulers and their shifting alliances. Despite these challenges, the East India Company persisted. Their breakthrough came not through brute force, but cunning negotiation. They offered local rulers access to European goods and promised lucrative returns, gradually embedding themselves into the trade networks of India and Southeast Asia. Their products, spices, textiles, and teas, were in high demand, and the merchants soon realized they had tapped into a gold mine. By the mid-17th century, the company was beginning to make its mark. Ships laden with goods arrived back in London, sparking a frenzy in European markets. Investors clamored to buy shares, lured by tales of exotic treasures and massive returns. What started as a modest trading venture had become a gateway to unimaginable riches. But this success came with a price. The company's rapid growth marked the beginning of its transformation. No longer content with trade alone, it began to eye greater power over land, resources, and the people who controlled them. What had started as a humble trade venture was evolving into something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. And so, the stage was set for the East India Company's next chapter, a transition from merchants to monarchs as they traded not just in goods, but in power. How did a group of traders become rulers of vast territories? By the early 18th century, the East India Company had evolved into much more than a mere trading outfit. It was no longer just a collection of merchants navigating perilous seas and brokering spice deals. It had become a force to be reckoned with, a corporate entity operating like a nation-state. But how does a company transition from trading goods to ruling vast territories? The answer lies in a combination of cunning diplomacy, ruthless ambition, and an uncanny ability to exploit chaos. The company's first significant foothold in India came through its trading posts, factories in places like Surat, Bombay, and Madras. These were hubs of commerce where spices, silks, and cotton flowed out and European goods flowed in. At first, the company operated with the permission of local rulers, offering tributes and acting subservient. But behind closed doors, they had far grander aspirations. Enter Robert Clive, a young man of humble origins who would become one of the most controversial figures in British and Indian history. Clive arrived in India as a lowly clerk for the company, but his sharp mind and daring spirit quickly propelled him into prominence. When the company faced threats from rival powers, both European and Indian, Clive seized the opportunity to prove his worth. His greatest triumph came at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. The Battle of Plassey wasn't just a military engagement, it was a turning point in history. Facing the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, and his vastly superior forces, Clive used bribery, deception, and tactical genius to secure a stunning victory. The company's forces, outnumbered and outgunned, succeeded in toppling one of the richest and most powerful rulers in India. This wasn't merely a battle over trade routes or profits, it marked the beginning of the company's territorial dominance. With Bengal under its control, the East India Company gained access to one of the wealthiest regions in the world. Its coffers overflowed with the riches of India, gold, silver, jewels, and an endless supply of resources. But more than wealth, the victory at Plassey gave the company something even more valuable: the power to govern. Through puppet rulers and strategic alliances, the company expanded its influence across the subcontinent. The company's rule wasn't just about conquest, it was about systematic control. They implemented a structure of governance, taxation, and legal systems that allowed them to tighten their grip on the region. Local industries were dismantled to favor British goods, and Indian artisans were reduced to mere laborers in their own lands. The company's army, now a formidable force of Indian sepoys commanded by British officers, became a tool of both expansion and suppression. But power always comes at a cost. The company's greed and disregard for local populations led to widespread famines and economic collapse in many regions under its control. The Bengal famine of 1770, which claimed the lives of millions, was a direct result of the company's exploitative policies. Yet, the profits kept flowing, and back in London, the company's directors basked in the glory of their empire. By the late 18th century, the East India Company had transformed from a group of merchants into the de facto rulers of vast territories. They were no longer just traders. They were monarchs in all but name, wielding power over millions of lives. But this meteoric rise was only the beginning. With power consolidated in their hands, the company was poised to become the undisputed ruler of India. But as the East India Company's influence grew, so did its enemies. Rivals from within and resistance from India's rulers began to challenge their dominance. What happens when an empire built on greed and ambition faces its first cracks? By the late 18th century, the East India Company had entered its golden age. This was a period of unparalleled wealth and influence, but it was also a time marked by devastating exploitation. The company's grip over India tightened as its coffers swelled, turning it into one of the richest and most powerful entities in the world. However, this glittering prosperity came at an extraordinary human cost. After its victory at the Battle of Plassey, the company began to exert greater control over Bengal, one of the most fertile and prosperous regions in India. Bengal's rich delta was the source of precious commodities like rice, silk, and opium, and the company wasted no time in monopolizing these industries. The introduction of a land revenue system, designed to extract as much wealth as possible, forced Indian farmers into crushing cycles of debt and dependency. The infamous Permanent Settlement of 1793 made landlords responsible for collecting taxes, ensuring that the burden fell disproportionately on peasants. The opium trade became one of the company's most lucrative ventures. Bengal became a hub for the cultivation of opium, which was then smuggled into China despite strict bans by the Chinese government. This illicit trade created a massive demand for the addictive drug, leading to the infamous opium wars of the 19th century. The company not only fueled an epidemic but also used it as a weapon to destabilize an entire nation, all in the name of profit. Back in Britain, the wealth generated by these exploitative practices transformed the company into a financial powerhouse. Lavish mansions, opulent parties, and political influence became the hallmarks of its directors and shareholders. The East India Company was no longer just a corporate entity. It was a dominant player in British society, wielding power over both Parliament and the Crown. Politicians and aristocrats became intertwined with the company's fortunes, ensuring that its interests were protected at the highest levels of government. But the company's pursuit of profit led to devastating consequences for India. Famines became an all-too-common occurrence, as the company's policies prioritized revenue over the well-being of the population. The Bengal famine of 1770, which claimed the lives of over 10 million people, was a direct result of the company's policies. While millions starved, the company's warehouses remained stocked with grain, intended for export rather than local relief. The company's rule also eroded India's traditional industries. The once thriving textile industry, known for its exquisite hand-woven fabrics, was decimated. Indian weavers, who had long been celebrated for their craftsmanship, found themselves outcompeted by cheap British imports. The company systematically dismantled local industries to create a dependent consumer base for British goods, turning India into a supplier of raw materials and a captive market. Amidst this exploitation, the company's governance was marked by corruption and decadence. Many of its officials, known as nabobs, amassed vast personal fortunes through bribes and extortion. Figures like Warren Hastings, the company's first Governor-General of India, embodied the duality of the company's rule. Brilliant administrators on one hand, yet deeply entangled in scandals and controversies on the other. Despite the suffering it caused, the company's control over India seemed unshakable. Its military, largely composed of Indian sepoys under British officers, was one of the most powerful forces in the world. The company had its own treasury, its own judiciary, and even its own foreign policy. For all intents and purposes, it was a sovereign state masquerading as a corporation. But no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to cracks. The East India Company's insatiable greed and unchecked power would soon sow the seeds of its own downfall. What happens when a company built on exploitation faces the wrath of those it oppressed? As the East India Company reached the zenith of its power, the cracks in its foundation began to show. What had started as a humble trade venture elevated to the heights of empire was now spiraling into chaos. Corruption, mismanagement, and greed crept into every corner of the company's operations, undermining the very empire it had built. One of the most glaring issues was the rampant corruption among company officials. Known as nabobs, these administrators often returned to Britain flaunting their immense ill-gotten wealth. Robert Clive, once hailed as the hero of Plassey, became a symbol of the company's corruption. His tenure in India brought staggering personal riches, but it also sparked accusations of extortion and abuse of power. During his impeachment in the British Parliament, Clive famously defended his actions, claiming, "I stand astonished at my own moderation." His case became a lightning rod for debates about the morality of the company's rule. But Clive was just one man in a system rife with greed. Company officials routinely exploited India's resources and people for personal gain. Bribes, illegal trade, and embezzlement were not just common, they were expected. These practices drained the company's coffers while alienating the Indian population, further eroding the fragile balance of power. The company's financial troubles were compounded by its mismanagement. By the late 18th century, the East India Company was struggling to govern its vast territories. Its officers were businessmen, not statesmen, and their governance reflected that. Policies were driven by short-term profit rather than long-term stability, leading to disastrous consequences. The Bengal famine of 1770 was one such tragedy. While millions of Indians starved, the company continued to demand exorbitant taxes, prioritizing revenue over human lives. This catastrophic event exposed the company's inability or unwillingness to govern responsibly. Back in Britain, the company's troubles were becoming impossible to ignore. Its mounting debts and administrative failures alarmed the British government, which had been content to let the company operate as a semi-sovereign entity. By the 1770s, the company was on the brink of financial collapse, prompting Parliament to intervene. The Regulating Act of 1773 was the first step in reining in the company's power, but it was far from a solution. The act established the position of Governor-General of India, but it also revealed the deepening rift between the company and the British state. The company's military operations further drained its resources. Maintaining a massive private army while expanding its territories required enormous funding. Wars with Indian rulers, resistance movements, and conflicts like the First Anglo-Mysore War added to the strain. The company's attempts to finance these ventures through aggressive taxation only fueled resentment among Indians, setting the stage for future uprisings. The situation reached a tipping point with the outbreak of the First Maratha War in 1775. This prolonged conflict against one of India's most formidable powers stretched the company's resources to the breaking point. It became clear that the East India Company was no longer the efficient, profit-generating machine it once was. It was a bloated, inefficient entity teetering on the edge of collapse. The British government's eventual bailout of the company marked a turning point. The Pitt's India Act of 1784 established greater state control over the company's operations, effectively transforming it into an arm of British imperial policy. While the company retained some autonomy, its days as an independent entity were numbered. The once mighty East India Company, which had built an empire through trade, war, and diplomacy, was now a shadow of its former self, propped up by a government that no longer trusted it. But the company's corruption and mismanagement were not its only enemies. Beneath the surface, discontent was brewing among the Indian populace, and the seeds of rebellion were being sown. What happens when those you exploit decide to rise up? The decline of the East India Company was as dramatic as its meteoric rise. What began as a humble trading venture in 1600 had morphed into a global powerhouse, wielding control over vast territories and millions of people. But by the 19th century, the cracks in its foundation had widened beyond repair. The company that once held the destiny of an empire in its hands now faced an ignoble end, marked by revolt, political backlash, and eventual nationalization. The seeds of the company's downfall were sown in its unchecked ambition. By the early 1800s, the company's governance over India had become increasingly untenable. Mismanagement, corruption, and oppressive taxation fueled widespread discontent among the Indian populace. The company's policies prioritized profit above all else, often at the expense of local communities and traditional economies. This exploitation created a volatile environment ripe for rebellion. The tipping point came in 1857 with the Indian Rebellion, also known as the Sepoy Mutiny. Sparked by rumors of cultural and religious insensitivity, specifically the use of pig and cow fat in cartridges for the Enfield rifles, the rebellion quickly spread across northern and central India. The uprising was not merely a response to the cartridge controversy, it was a culmination of decades of resentment against the company's oppressive policies and disregard for local traditions. Indian soldiers in the company's army turned against their British officers, and the revolt gained support from various segments of society, including dispossessed rulers and peasants. The rebellion shocked the British establishment. The East India Company, with its private army, had always been seen as a formidable force. Yet, it struggled to contain the uprising, revealing the fragility of its control over India. The British Crown had to intervene, sending its military forces to quell the rebellion. After months of brutal fighting, the rebellion was suppressed, but it came at an enormous cost, both in lives and in the company's credibility. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 marked the beginning of the end for the East India Company. The British government, already skeptical of the company's governance, saw the rebellion as proof that it could no longer be trusted with ruling India. In 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, formally dissolving the East India Company and transferring its administrative powers to the British Crown. The company's vast empire was nationalized, and Queen Victoria was declared the Empress of India in 1876, symbolizing the complete transition of power. This nationalization marked the end of an era. The East India Company, once the world's most powerful corporation, was now a relic of history. Its legacy, however, was far from forgotten. The company's rise and fall left a profound impact on the global economic and political landscape. It had pioneered the concept of the modern multinational corporation and demonstrated both the potential and the perils of corporate power. But it also left a legacy of exploitation, cultural destruction, and deep scars on the societies it had dominated. The East India Company's fall also reshaped the relationship between Britain and India. The direct governance of India by the British Crown laid the groundwork for nearly a century of colonial rule, which would have far-reaching consequences for both nations. While the company's name faded into obscurity, the debates surrounding its actions on corporate ethics, the role of private enterprise in governance, and the balance of power between profit and responsibility remain relevant to this day. The fall of the East India Company was not just the end of a corporation, it was the beginning of a new chapter in global history. But what lessons can we learn from its dramatic rise and fall? The story of the East India Company is one of ambition, innovation, exploitation, and eventual collapse. Its rise from a modest trading venture to a global superpower reshaped economies, cultures, and geopolitics, leaving behind lessons that resonate far beyond its time. What can we learn from the meteoric rise and catastrophic fall of the world's first corporation? At its core, the East India Company pioneered the modern multinational corporation. It introduced the concept of limited liability, where individual investors could share in profits without risking their entire fortune. This innovation allowed the company to attract unprecedented capital, setting a template for corporate structures that persist to this day. But while it demonstrated the potential of corporate enterprise, it also revealed its darker side, the unchecked pursuit of profit, often at the expense of ethics, humanity, and sustainability. One of the most striking lessons lies in the dangers of unregulated power. The East India Company was granted extraordinary autonomy by the British Crown, allowing it to act as a quasi-governmental entity. It minted its own currency, maintained its own army, and negotiated treaties with sovereign nations, all with minimal oversight. This unrestrained authority led to systemic corruption, exploitation, and abuse of power. It serves as a cautionary tale for modern corporations operating in unregulated spaces, where the absence of checks and balances can lead to disastrous consequences. The company's legacy is also a stark reminder of the human cost of empire. In India, the East India Company's policies disrupted traditional industries, caused famines, and eroded cultural institutions. The Bengal famine of 1770, in which millions perished, was exacerbated by the company's insistence on maximizing revenue at all costs. These events underscore the importance of prioritizing social responsibility over short-term gains, a principle often overlooked in the corporate world even today. Another critical lesson from the East India Company's story is the role of governance in holding corporations accountable. Its eventual downfall was precipitated by widespread outrage over its mismanagement and exploitation. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was the culmination of decades of resentment against its oppressive rule. The British government's decision to nationalize the company and assume direct control of its territories marked a turning point in corporate accountability. It highlighted the necessity of regulatory frameworks to prevent the concentration of power in private hands and to ensure that corporations serve the public good. Beyond the boardrooms and balance sheets, the East India Company's legacy is intertwined with the cultural and political identities of the regions it influenced. In India, the scars of colonial exploitation are still visible, but so is the resilience of its people. The resistance against the company laid the foundation for India's eventual struggle for independence, fostering a sense of unity and purpose among its diverse populations. For modern corporations, the East India Company serves as both an inspiration and a warning. It showed how innovation and ambition could reshape the world, but it also revealed the perils of prioritizing profit over humanity. In an era where multinational corporations wield influence comparable to nation-states, the story of the East India Company is more relevant than ever. It challenges us to consider the ethical responsibilities of corporate power and to ask difficult questions. How can companies balance profitability with social good? Where do we draw the line between ambition and exploitation? The East India Company's story is not just a chapter in history, it's a mirror reflecting the complexities of power, ambition, and responsibility. As we navigate the challenges of globalization and corporate influence today, its rise and fall offer lessons that we ignore at our own peril. The question is, are we paying attention? If you found this video enlightening, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps the channel grow. Click the next video for an even more intriguing story on business and finance. Thanks for watching.